Batting last for our conference today is Erica Jones. Erica is going to speak on the ecology of justice, transforming the victim-perpetrator paradigm. She is in her final semester in the MA in the integral ecology in the PCC program at CIIS. Currently residing in Oakland, she has loved and been loved by lands as disparate and varied as North Florida swamps, Australian bush, and the Pacific Northwest rainforest. Erica has been active in social movements for human rights and political liberation, and was the co-founder of Sustainable Ballard, a nonprofit in Seattle which educates, inspires, and engages neighbors to take action to live more sustainably, both individually and collectively. She looks forward to combining her recent esoteric spiritual studies with activist goals in pursuit of biocracy, or a democracy inclusive of the non-human world. Please welcome Erica Jones. Woo!
Thank you, Rand. Hello, everyone. So, the ecology of justice, transforming the victim-perpetrator paradigm. We find ourselves in a universe which expresses itself in differentiated consciousness, bringing with it the divide we locate between self and other. And yet, differentiation is simultaneously a division and a connection. The cosmos is profoundly and fundamentally relational, and I find the beauty of justice described in the symmetry of reciprocity. Its loops and curves seeking to connect all beings and strike a dynamic balance. Dynamic because balance does not reflect a static state. And so it is with reciprocity, the practice of exchanging things with others for mutual benefit. Reciprocity is a process that requires our care, our attention, our presence, and tending. That we are all different from each other is a given. Where or how we intersect is quite another matter. Could our notions of and practice of justice reflect whether we perceive our differences as alienation or as an opportunity for communion? The unified field is broken. Can we see only its dividing aspect and not its relational aspect? What is our imagination of relationship itself? Philosopher Cornel West offers us the perspective that justice is what love looks like in public. Justice is what love looks like in public, and does not justice live at the heart of a society, the great integrator able to hold the multiplicity within the unity? At that precious intersection where our diverse experiences meet? How can we practice a justice which is restorative of our relationships, which honors both diversity and unity? In answer to this question, I've made a study of restorative justice models, environmental ethics, and a healing modality called family or systemic constellations. Therefore, my stance is informed by a systemic view of the human being and close attention to the relational aspects of our existence. Restorative justice can be defined as a process whereby all the parties with a stake in a particular offense come together to resolve collectively how to deal with the aftermath of the offense and its implications for the future. Environmental ethics is the discipline and philosophy that studies the moral relationship of human beings to, and also the value and moral status of the environment and its non-human contents. And I believe that the modality of systemic constellations has the potential of uniting these two, restorative justice and environmental ethics, because it reveals the hidden architecture of relationships and provides a means of communication through relational fields. And it's funny, one uses the word justice, and most people get the image of vengeance or retribution. Vengeance and scapegoating are not on my agenda. I believe that justice fundamentally requires connection. So with this in mind, how can we practice a justice which is restorative of our relationships? The first place to start could be with curiosity, not knowing. The wisdom of not knowing frees us from limiting prejudices, from casting the world in simple roles of good and bad, that blessed, accursed binary that has carried the human species this far in our evolution. What is your capacity for holding paradox? And if this is too saccharine or too sweet, maybe a better starting point would be to acknowledge that we each live ethically compromised lives. No one is untouched by the basic ethical dilemma of being alive. For one, I don't think it's possible to be alive on this planet and not somehow harm a living being in some way or other. But more to the point, when I use the cosmos as my reference rather than my specific human culture, I realize that I enter this world without a precise roadmap. There's no neat little if-then statement list that can guide my actions so that I remain good in relation to all others. Owing the omnicentric nature of reality, the infinite web of connections which interweave all life, there are no precisely correct ethical arguments, only better ones. I'm afraid that both as individuals and as collectives we're called to develop ourselves, to grow our understanding of what it means to be human. Not only does the individual face this challenge of the descent, of facing one's own personal shadow in order to see the other more clearly and thus develop better ethical relationships, but all collectives at some point are faced with this process. And life is in process. Coming to consciousness is happening all the time. So we must challenge old moral codes as they no longer obtain to current situations, to new understandings. And the capacity for empathy, the moral imagination is alive in all of us, somewhere. On a planetary scale, we in industrialized societies exist within a particularly compromised ethical situation. From the perspective of environmental ethics, one prejudice which operates across our modern human institutions, a structural prejudice, if you will, is speciesism. Speciesism is the widely held belief that the human species is inherently superior to other species and so has rights or privileges that are denied to others. In my view, this must be overcome if we are to survive as a species. All of these considerations, for me, ultimately point toward vulnerability. What if we treated our boundaries as things to be nourished and protected rather than hoarded and defended? Boundaries form relationships, and I can imagine treating them not with fear and revulsion, but rather as the doorway to all which is, a doorway to unity through diversity, a doorway to moral regeneration. When I think again of how we might practice a justice which is restorative of our relationships, a justice which deepens our connections rather than deepening the dividing lines between victims and perpetrators, the imaginal wisdom of the human heart begins to rise in me. The heart seems to me quite a bit more than just some kind of mechanical pump, as it's too often imagined, or as a source of weakness, irrationality, or compromised judgment. The heart is the center of our feelings, our emotional life. And I also envision it in a more esoteric light. The heart is the seat of the imagination and a gateway to the soul. And the soul, as James Hillman has said, is what turns the mere events of life into experiences. This is no small role that the heart plays in our perception and cognition, and the heart has been too long neglected and misunderstood, misused even, by the mainstream of the culture in which I find myself. And given the amount of strife on the planet today, perhaps that's no coincidence, for an important part of the capacity to develop an ethical orientation resides within the heart. Plumbing the depths of the imagination requires us to listen deeply, because its territory is not a literal one. It doesn't live in the daylit world of the ego, which has all its fixed meanings set up in a nice little framework. Ego is quite confident of who is good, who's bad. I like that, I'm going to go for that, and oof, I'll stay away. And of course that's functional to something. Certainly the ego has its role. However, it strikes me that life is not on a linear path. It is, as we are, filled with ambiguities, contradictions, and ambivalences in our relationships to others, And within this messiness, which is often regarded as undesirable or something to be escaped, is incredible generative capacity. But to see it, to interact with that enormous generative capacity, takes imagination. To take the step outside of literalism and into the paradoxical is an invitation to enter into a more playful or flexible relationship with the cosmos and with oneself. Authentic engagement with the imagination brings us into contact with the autopoetic properties of nature and psyche, its mode of creativity. If I wish to see the whole of a person, a family, a society, a worldview, I must see more deeply than its apparent exterior. And I must allow that neither an individual nor a collective can be reduced down to a single meaning that I assign to it. For example, my father is a human being. He's way more than just my father, as if he were my pet possession, or as if I were his pet possession. For these assignments of meaning go both ways. Our relationships serve to define us as much as the other. It seems we are already connected, like it or not. Now, perhaps the pliancy of the heart is what can make room for multiple outcomes, for the unexpected positive consequence of what seemed like a bad turn, the wisdom of not knowing, of being in uncertainties and doubts, as John Keats has said, of remaining curious and open to life as opposed to, say, being locked in a trauma response, repeating the same horrors over and over again in our lives, just finding new people to slot into preordained roles. The division between us also connects us. But what will fill the divide? Fear, paranoia, suspicion, the rehearsal of well-worn roles of victim, persecutor, and rescuer? Or is there the opportunity there for all involved to promote moral regeneration? I propose that a critical component for the existence of justice is shared common ground. Now, this in theory is held by the context of our society, at least as far as the human world goes, for there is the specter of speciesism. Our social institutions supposedly hold this hallowed ground safely in secular hands. But a little investigation will reveal to any open-minded inquirer that social institutions are systematically less safe for and less just towards some than others. And I'm speaking of all the various institutionalized and structural prejudices, all the isms, which cut in so many directions because our human identities just aren't reducible to one facet. But cut, these isms do. And some people have violence forced on them because of the color of their skin. And I'm thinking of Trayvon Martin when I say this, while others, for the same reason, have a choice to avoid violence. Some unjustly live life permanently under suspicion of the law, while those whose concentration of power threatens the very vitality of this planet occupy the highest offices of authority in the land. And that's the truth. Corruption runs deep. And I say this not with a hardened heart. I do not say these things as some dry, analytical recitation of some situation that will never change with all the set roles, the victim, the perpetrator, the rescuer. And I suppose this is because I occupy a world in process. It's characterized by change. So I'm more than just a little curious about what happens next. But the critical question, who has the power? How can deep, lasting social transformation toward justice, that is, right relationship, happen? And I've been working with philosopher Rollo May's concept of power as the ability to cause or prevent change. That's it. The ability to cause or prevent change. May is an existentialist, and accordingly, that's not been satisfactory for me. So I've been sitting with it for a couple of years, and I now amend May's definition and propose that power is the ability to cause or prevent change which arises out of the fact of communion. And I'm referring to communion as a specific term, which Brian Swim and Thomas Berry describe in The Universe Story and elsewhere as one of three central ordering tendencies of the universe, cosmogenetic principles, which stand in contrast to entropy. Communion here means interrelatedness, mutuality, kinship, complementarity. And it defines and shapes the universe. Nothing is itself except in relation to everything else. This definition of power is important, this distinction around communion, because it doesn't say that power inheres within objects. It locates power in the relationship between entities. So it's not a matter of wresting power away from someone else in order to be powerful, to have power. It's more a matter of how one relates to the other. This definition of power, the ability to cause or prevent change which arises from the fact of communion, draws in the other two central ordering principles of the universe as identified by Swim and Berry, and those are differentiation, that is, diversity, complexity, variation, and disparity, and autopoiesis, subjectivity, sentience, self-manifestation, identity. And it's a rather different view of reality from the mainstream, and I'm sorry, I don't have time to get more into this aspect here, but my notion of power is important because I do not place my faith in existing cultural forms and modes to accomplish an evolutionary task. I feel that the transition out of a victim-perpetrator paradigm of relationships with alienated parties warring over power, and usually under the banner of justice, will not be facilitated by continuing to operate within that mode. A new and irrelevant cosmology is needed to co-create a new reality with the living earth. But so many are so invested in our existing cultural forms and institutions, and think that's all that's there, that's all that's available. So thinking that our only options are the adversarial legal system, which largely exists to buttress the authority and the power of the state, not build healthy relationships between community members, or thinking that conducting warfare or violent campaigns of insurgency it's the only way to cause change or to prevent change. So I agree with Thomas Berry on the following, quote, "We must go far beyond any transformation of contemporary culture. We must go back to the genetic imperative from which human cultures emerge originally and from which they can never be separated without losing their integrity and their survival capacity. None of our existing cultures can deal with this situation out of its own resources. We must invent or reinvent a sustainable human culture by a descent into our pre-rational, our instinctive resources. Our cultural resources have lost their integrity. They cannot be trusted. What is needed is not transcendence, but inscendence. Not the brain, but the gene." And so, I would like to propose the development of a relatively new cultural form which has been slowly taking shape in sites of conflict across the globe over the last few decades. And basically what's emerging for me is a synthesis of the principles of restorative justice with the modality of systemic constellations, which is set within the understandings of environmental ethics. It's still theoretical, but it's an idea that's been thinking about itself for about 8 years. I just cannot imagine being able to transition to a new system of governance, a new and deeper iteration of democracy, with the existence of all the institutionalized prejudices, all the structural hindrances to good decision-making by the collective, all the paranoia, the violence between various components of the collective. This all stands in the way, to my mind, of ever really building something different, something which approaches the beauty of justice, reciprocity. I envision a highly localized process which might be similar to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission model of restorative justice, which South Africa made famous, but with an added layer of aiming for a deeper form of democracy which includes the non-human world as well. And I'll call it bocracy for now, but I don't really like that term. I haven't come up with a new one. I think that we're called upon to form a new model of governance, and that first, creating an appropriate container for the transmutation of all those, frankly, demonic energies could teach us so much about how to creatively respond to the evolutionary challenges facing human society today. I definitely don't have time to elaborate on why, since systemic constellations seems to provide an evolutionary edge to a truth and reconciliation process, but I can say that it has shown me that it is possible to directly access and interact with the fields of information that collectives generate and share, which includes all the ancestral wounds that we are carrying and mostly unconsciously reenacting. With skilled facilitators, it is possible to identify blockages and entanglements within systems of relationships and free these, remove these, so that love can flow in the system. And this love does not have to be taught how to flow or where to go or what to do. Only the blockages need to be removed to begin the process. And this is not an easy task. Wow, I think that I'm drawn to this kind of work because I think that this is where the war lives. I think that the war between self and other, which diminishes, if not destroys, our possibilities of communion with creation, of full participation, live, are bound up in all of these horrible structural prejudices. And I don't think we can simply work to heal wounds anymore. We have to grow through them and step into the present moment, accept the evolutionary challenge, and thereby learn how to access our collective wisdom for decision making. The species level wisdom that I know exists, I'm quite sure of it. What is needed is not the brain, but the gene. Going down into the depths, into the unknown, especially into the taboo, to break the rules of the victim-perpetrator paradigm of alienation. And of course, we have to address and include our social problems with the greater Earth community. The vulnerability of omnicentricity. Shall we treat our boundaries as something to be nourished and protected rather than hoarded and defended? For how else could we as humanity enter into life's panentheophonic rhapsody to know that unity is not antagonistic to diversity, that heterogeneity promises resiliency, if we but moved beyond the story of the estranged victim and perpetrator, finally beyond the confinement of an ego of a culture, untempered by the strangely impersonal personal love that binds you to me in that infinite embrace of gravity.
Yeah.
Woo!